The morning rush hour was merciless. Horns blared, brakes screamed, and the sun's glare bounced off every windshield like a spotlight on disaster. Right in the center of the intersection, Clara Bennett's Range Rover shuddered, coughed, and died, leaving her stranded in a sea of angry drivers. She slammed her palm against the steering wheel, her heartbeat racing faster than the traffic lights flipping above. In the back seat, little Sophie Bennett clutched her worn-out stuffed bunny, her wide blue eyes brimming with fear. "Mommy, are we going to be late?" she whispered, her small voice nearly drowned by the chaos outside. Clara forced a smile she didn't feel, every muscle in her face tight. She couldn't tell Sophie the truth, that being late today might cost her everything. She had built her company brick by brick, clawed her way through boardrooms filled with men who wanted her to fail. And now, on the very morning of the biggest meeting of her career, fate had decided to choke her engine and trap her in full view of strangers who only saw a broken-down car, not the storm unraveling inside her chest. Engines thundered in a discordant chorus around Clara's disabled SUV, each rev like an impatient snarl in her ears. Luxury sedans and gleaming convertibles swerved dangerously close, their drivers leaning out of open windows to hurl insults she could barely process. Horns blared in short, angry bursts, and clenched fists punched the air as if their rage alone could move her stranded vehicle. Trapped in the middle of that storm, Clara gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her pulse hammered so hard it felt as if the veins in her temples might burst. Then came a different sound. Thin, sharp, almost out of place, the screech of bicycle tires carving across the asphalt sliced through the chaos. Clara's eyes darted toward the noise, and for the briefest moment, disbelief flickered across her face. Out of the blur of steel and chrome, a lone figure rolled into view. He coasted to a stop just feet from her SUV, and against the backdrop of furious drivers in designer suits and polished cars worth more than some houses, his presence looked almost absurd. He was no corporate executive or roadside savior dressed in shining armor. His shirt, a faded blue mechanic's button-up, was stained with grease and time, the kind of marks no detergent could erase. A threadbare patch clung stubbornly to his chest, stitched with the name Daniel Carter. Slung across his shoulder was not a briefcase or laptop bag, but a battered canvas toolkit, swaying gently with each step. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. He stood there with one hand gripping the handlebars of his bike, his gaze fixed not on the angry crowd, not on the snarling traffic, but on Clara's face, her eyes wide with panic, her lips pressed into a thin line of dread. The world seemed to hold its breath. Around them, the fury of strangers circled like vultures sensing weakness, their judgment heavy, unspoken, yet suffocating. Daniel hesitated, no longer than a blink, but long enough for Clara to feel the sting of vulnerability. Then, with a calm that seemed almost reckless in such chaos, he lowered his bike to the curb, squared his shoulders, and raised his voice above the chorus of horns. "Need a hand?" The words were simple, yet they sliced through the madness like a lifeline tossed into a storm. Clara blinked, her pride instinctively snapping back into place. "This is a Range Rover," she shot back, her voice sharp, edged with fear disguised as arrogance. "You can't just tinker with it." But Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes didn't linger on her, but flicked toward the back seat. There, little Sophie sat clutching her stuffed bunny so tightly its ears bent, her small shoulders trembling with every angry honk that rattled the glass. Clara followed his gaze, and for the first time, she saw her daughter's fear mirrored back at her. Daniel's voice softened, carrying a steadiness that somehow cut through the noise. "She looks scared," he said gently. "Let me try." There was no bravado, no arrogance, just certainty, an unshaken tone that disarmed Clara's defenses more effectively than any argument could. She exhaled a long, reluctant sigh, her pride giving way to desperation. With a sharp pull, she popped the hood. "Fine," she muttered. "Just don't make it worse." Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. His movements were efficient, almost rhythmic, the quiet confidence of a man who had lived with machines in his hands. He traced wires, tugged clamps, and checked connections with the kind of familiarity that comes only from thousands of hours bent over engines. Around them, the crowd began to shift. The same passers-by who had mocked and jeered moments before now slowed their steps, curiosity replacing disdain. Something in the air had changed. It no longer felt like just a roadside repair. It felt like a small rebellion against indifference, a story unfolding before their eyes. Minutes passed, though for Clara they stretched into an eternity. Then Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag pulled from his back pocket. "Loose thermostat wire," he said matter-of-factly. "It should hold until you get it to a shop." Clara slid back into the driver's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the key. The engine roared back to life, a deep, familiar sound that flooded her with relief so sharp it almost made her dizzy. She looked up at Daniel, stunned, her disbelief plain. "Wait, you actually fixed it?" He gave her a small, almost self-conscious smile, already stepping back. "Glad I could help." Her instincts scrambled to catch up. She reached for her purse, fumbling with the strap. "Hold on," she blurted. "How much do I owe you?" Daniel shook his head, already glancing back at his bike. "No charge, just doing a good deed." Clara stared at him, thrown off balance. Gratitude and offense tangled inside her chest. "You don't want anything?" she pressed, her voice almost incredulous. Daniel lifted a hand in parting, not even turning fully around. "Nope." And then he was gone, melting back into the chaos he had so effortlessly cut through. In the middle of snarling traffic, blaring horns, and the impatience of a city that never slowed, Clara Bennett sat in her restored SUV, her daughter clutching her bunny in the back seat, and realized she had just met the stranger who would rewrite the entire course of her life. Daniel was already mounting his bike, ready to vanish back into the swarm of traffic, when a small, trembling voice cut through the noise. "Wait!" Both Clara and Daniel froze. The back window of the Range Rover rolled down, and 6-year-old Sophie leaned out, her little hands clutching something wrinkled and colorful. A crayon drawing, her cheeks flushed, but her voice was steady. "She's my mom," Sophie announced to the stranger who had just saved them. "Please, marry her." Time stopped. The horns, the shouting. Even Clara's frantic heartbeat seemed to fade into silence. Daniel turned slowly, his eyes catching the sunlight as if the world itself demanded he look. For a moment, he simply stared, at Sophie's fragile courage, at the drawing she held like holy scripture. Clara lunged forward, panic surging. "Sophie, honey, no!" She snatched the paper from her daughter's hands, pressing it to her chest. "That's not something you can just say." Here her voice cracked, equal parts embarrassment and desperation. But Sophie didn't back down. Her eyes glistened with a child's stubborn honesty. "You fixed our car," she whispered firmly, "and you smiled, like daddies do." Clara's face burned crimson. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She expected Daniel to laugh, to wave it off, to make some awkward joke. But he didn't. Daniel stood in the middle of the road, still, silent, the city rushing past him. His expression wasn't mocking or amused. It was something heavier, something Clara couldn't read, respect, maybe even a quiet ache. He gave Sophie a single, solemn nod, nothing more. Then he turned back to his bike, gripping the handlebars with fingers that seemed tighter than before. Without a word, he pedaled into the current of traffic, disappearing into the blur of steel and sunlight. Clara sat frozen behind the wheel, Sophie's drawing pressed against her chest. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she unfolded it. 7 days later, Clara Bennett found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter than she should. She told herself it was coincidence, just a quick stop at the nearest garage for the faint rattle her Range Rover had started making that morning. But when the GPS ended at a faded sign that read Carter's Auto Repair, her chest tightened. Fate wasn't finished with her. The garage sat between a bakery and a laundromat. Sunlight spilling across the cracked pavement, Clara stepped out, heels clicking, her blazer sharp, her expression sharper, until a small voice broke her facade. "Hi." Sophie had spotted a little girl peeking out from behind a tool cabinet, messy curls framed curious brown eyes. She wore sneakers clearly worn from 1,000 adventures. "Emily Carter." Sophie hesitated, clutching her bunny by the ear. Then, in the fearless way only children knew, she asked, "Want to draw with me?" Within minutes, the two girls were cross-legged on a spare tire, coloring with Sophie's crayons as if they'd been friends forever. Laughter, soft, innocent, bounced against the smell of oil and steel. cutting through the weight in Clara's chest. And then she saw him. Daniel Carter rose from beneath the hood of a red pickup, wiping his hands on a rag. For a second, surprise flashed across his face. Then he smiled faintly. "You again?" Clara tried to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. "Yeah, small world." He chuckled, motioning to her SUV. "Not the usual place for a corporate powerhouse like you." She folded her arms, defensive. "My assistant's on vacation. Google Maps betrayed me." Daniel smirked, then leaned over the engine with the same calm precision she remembered. No rush, no ego, just methodical care. Clara watched silently, struck by the quiet authority in his movements. He didn't posture like the men in her boardroom, didn't drown the air with empty promises. He simply worked. "Loose heat shield," he said after a while, tightening a bolt. "Easy fix." Clara exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. And in that moment, between the laughter of two little girls plotting with crayons and the quiet competence of a man who asked for nothing, Clara saw something she hadn't in years, a life untouched by pretense. For the first time, she wondered if their breakdown in the middle of traffic hadn't been an accident at all. Clara reached instinctively for her purse the moment Daniel closed the hood. "At least let me pay you this time," she said, already thumbing through her wallet. Daniel shook his head. "How about a coffee instead? Someday? No pressure? No wink? No smirk? Just plain sincerity." Clara froze, caught off guard. In her world, every favor came with a price tag. Every smile with a hidden clause. This man was different, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Minutes later, she buckled Sophie into the back seat. Relief lingered in her chest, but so did confusion. She started the engine, adjusted the mirror, then stopped. A small plastic bag sat neatly beside Sophie's crayon box. "What's that?" Clara murmured. She opened it, and her breath caught. Inside lay a pair of tiny sneakers, white canvas, freshly washed. The laces a bright, hopeful pink. Sophie's exact size. Sophie gasped, eyes wide. "They're just like Emily's." Clara's fingers trembled around the shoes. Her mind spun back to the morning, when Sophie's shoelace had snapped. She remembered Daniel crouched by the Range Rover, his gaze flicking briefly to Sophie's frayed sneakers. He hadn't said a word then. He hadn't said a word now. He had simply noticed and quietly acted. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't diamonds. It wasn't the grand gestures men in her world used to impress. It was smaller, quieter, yet it pierced deeper than anything Clara had felt in years. She blinked rapidly, throat tight, forcing herself to look through the windshield before Sophie noticed the shimmer in her eyes. Outside, Daniel had already disappeared back into the garage, not seeking thanks, not waiting for recognition. Sophie hugged the sneakers to her chest as if they were treasure. "Mommy," she whispered, a smile spreading across her face, "I think Emily and I are going to be best friends." Clara glanced in the rearview mirror. The sight of her daughter cradling that tiny gift made her heart ache in a way success and money never could. For the first time in years, she wondered, was someone finally seeing them? Not as a CEO and her child, but as two souls worth caring for? The cafe was small, almost hidden between an antique bookstore and a florist, the kind of place people forgot existed. Clara sat across from Daniel, steam rising from her untouched cup. She had come out of politeness, or so she told herself, but now, staring at him in the golden light, she realized she wanted answers. Daniel stirred his coffee slowly, eyes fixed on the swirl. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost raw. Her name was Rachel. Clara blinked. "Rachel?" "My wife," he said simply. "We were high school sweethearts, young, reckless, but we thought love was enough. When Rachel got pregnant, we were terrified, but we chose each other." He paused, his hands tightening around the mug. "The day Emily was born, everything happened too fast. Rachel smiled at me one moment, holding my hand, and the next, alarms were blaring, nurses rushing. Complications." The word hung heavy in the air. Clara leaned forward, breath caught in her throat. Daniel's eyes glistened but didn't break. "I held my daughter 5 minutes after she entered the world, and I buried her mother 2 days later." Silence swallowed the room. The cafe chatter seemed miles away, muted under the weight of his confession. Clara felt her chest ache as if the grief had seeped into her own bones. I tried to go back to engineering, Daniel continued, his voice steadier now. Big office, projects, deadlines, but every time I left Emily, it felt like abandoning Rachel all over again. I couldn't do it. I walked away. Clara searched his face, not for pity, but for truth. And there it was, a man who had been broken and rebuilt, not by ambition, but by love and loss. I fixed cars because it was all I could manage, Daniel said softly. Something honest, something I could control. But raising Emily, that was the only thing that mattered. The only thing that kept me breathing. For the first time in years. Clara had no words. It started with tears Clara couldn't explain. She found Sophie curled up on her bed, face buried in her pillow, shoulders trembling. Honey, what happened? Clara whispered, brushing golden strands from her daughter's cheek. Sophie's voice cracked. They said I don't have a dad. They laughed at me. Her small hands clutched her bunny tighter. I'm not normal. Mommy! Clara's heart shattered. She wanted to scream, to storm into that classroom and tear the cruelty from the children's mouths. Instead, she pulled Sophie close, rocking her. You are the most special girl in the world. Don't you ever believe otherwise. But even as she said it, Clara knew the wound went deeper. Love from a mother could only cover so much. There was a hollow space Sophie longed to fill. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at Clara's door, returning a spare car key. He noticed the tiredness in Clara's smile, the heaviness in her eyes. What's wrong? He asked gently. Clara hesitated, then let it spill. Sophie's been struggling. Some kids teased her for not having a dad. There's a Father's Day event at school. She doesn't want to go. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't say much, just nodded, thoughtful, and left. The next morning, when Sophie opened her school locker, something slipped out. A folded piece of cardstock, carefully written in block letters. Lily, you are the bravest girl I know. From your proud second dad. Her hands trembled as she read it. Kids gathered around, pointing, whispering. One girl smiled. Wow, your dad made that for you? Sophie hesitated. He's not my real dad, another child piped up. Well, my stepdad never made me anything like that, a boy added. I wish my dad said stuff like that. Sophie blinked, stunned, then slowly smiled. For the first time in weeks, she lifted her head, shoulders straighter, heart lighter. That evening, Clara found her daughter humming as she colored at the kitchen table. Joy glowed in her cheeks again. Clara turned to Daniel, who had dropped by to fix a minor rattle in the car. You wrote that note, didn't you? She asked softly. Daniel shrugged, almost embarrassed. She deserved to know she's not alone. Clara's throat tightened. In that moment, she realized Daniel wasn't just fixing wires under hoods. He was repairing something far more fragile, her daughter's heart. The knock on Daniel's garage door wasn't hurried. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind that carried weight. When he opened it, he didn't find Clara, but a woman who looked like an older version of her. Regal posture, pearl necklace, eyes like polished steel, Margaret Bennett. Mr. Carter? She asked, though her tone left no room for doubt. She stepped inside without invitation, heels clicking against the concrete floor. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, wary. Can I help you? I'll be direct, Margaret said. Her voice clipped. My daughter is a remarkable woman. She's rebuilt her life and her company after betrayal and scandal. She deserves stability, prestige, not a mechanic with oil on his hands. Daniel stiffened, but said nothing. Margaret's gaze hardened. Do not mistake gratitude for love. Clara confuses kindness with permanence. She always has. And if you truly care about her, you'll step aside before she pays the price. The words cut deeper than she knew. Images flashed in Daniel's mind. Sophie clutching the sneakers he left behind, Emily laughing beside her new friend. Clara's guarded smile slowly softening. For the first time in years, he had felt like more than a father. More than a man mired in grief. And now, this woman was telling him it was an illusion. Mrs. Bennett, Daniel began, but his voice faltered. The certainty that usually guided him under a hood seemed to slip away. Margaret leaned closer, her perfume sharp, her words sharper. Be the good man you seem to be. Don't ruin her future. Let her go. She turned without waiting for a reply, disappearing into a sleek black car waiting at the curb. Daniel stood in the silence of his garage, her words echoing like oil dripping into water, spreading, staining. That night, when Clara called, he didn't answer. When she texted, he stared at the screen until the light went dark. For the first time since meeting her, Daniel chose distance over courage, and it tore at him more than any grief he had known. Daniel sat on the edge of his workbench, head in his hands. The garage was quiet except for the ticking of cooling metal. Emily wandered in, holding 2 juice boxes. She handed one to him, her voice small but steady. "Daddy," she said, "are we going to see Sophie again?" Daniel hesitated, his chest tightening. "Probably not." Emily frowned, her little brow creased. "Why not? I like her. She made me laugh. We were like a team." Daniel forced a smile, but it broke at the edges. Emily leaned closer, her eyes fierce for someone so young. "Don't let someone else tell us what family is supposed to look like." Her words landed harder than any blow. For a moment, Daniel felt his daughter teaching him what he had forgotten. Courage. Across town, Clara faced her own battlefield. Her mother's voice was sharp, relentless. "Clara, think of your reputation, your company. A mechanic cannot give you the life you deserve." Clara rose from her chair, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Mother, Daniel doesn't just fix cars. He fixed Sophie's heart when I couldn't, and mine too, even when I didn't know it was broken." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but Clara didn't stop. "I don't need prestige. I need someone who shows up. Someone good. That's Daniel." That night, the rain came down like a punishment. It hammered the streets with relentless force, bouncing off the pavement in silver streams, pooling in gutters that could barely contain the flood. The wind carried the sharp scent of wet asphalt and rust, and the night sky hung low, heavy with storm clouds that refused to release their grip. Clara stood in front of the garage, soaked through, the chill sinking deep into her bones. Her hair clung to her face, her clothes plastered against her skin, her shoes squelching in puddles that formed beneath her. Yet she didn't move, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. But the shiver that rippled through her wasn't only from the cold. She was holding herself together. As if by sheer willpower alone, she could stop the weight of years from dragging her down. Minutes stretched into something longer, something crueler. Time seemed to slow under the storm's roar. Each passing second another test of her resolve. Her body begged her to leave, to seek warmth, to surrender. But her heart, her stubborn, aching heart, refused. She had run away too many times. Tonight, she would not. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sound broke through the storm, the groan of hinges, old and reluctant as the garage door creaked open. A sliver of warm light cut into the night, spilling across the wet concrete. Daniel stepped out, framed by the glow inside. Shadows clung to him, but the light behind him painted the outline of his figure. The same figure she had once known by heart, the same presence she had once sworn she could never face again. His eyes fell on her, and for a moment, they widened in disbelief. There she was, soaked, trembling, fragile in every way that mattered, and yet standing as though nothing in the world could move her. "You're here," Daniel said, his voice breaking softly, almost as if he were speaking to a ghost. Clara swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. The rain disguised her tears, running in streams down her cheeks, masking the storm within her. Her lips quivered as she whispered, steady but fragile, "I'm not leaving, Daniel. Not this time." For one suspended heartbeat, the world held still. The rain didn't matter. The cold didn't matter. The storm around them became nothing but background noise to the silence between them. A silence thick with all the unsaid words, the regrets, the grief, the longing that had weighed on them for years. They stared at each other, unflinching. Two souls stripped bare, no longer hiding behind anger or fear, and in that shared gaze, something shifted. The years of distance dissolved, not erased, not forgotten, but softened, as if the storm had washed them clean. Daniel moved first, slowly, as though afraid the moment might shatter. He opened his arms. Clara's resolve broke. She stumbled forward, closing the space between them in a rush of rain and breath and trembling need. She fell into his embrace, her forehead pressing against his chest, her body shaking as if every ounce of pain she had carried finally demanded release. Daniel's arms closed around her with a strength she had almost forgotten, pulling her tight, shielding her from the cold even as the storm drenched them both. His hand found the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her wet hair, anchoring her as though letting go would mean losing her forever. For the first time in what felt like years, Clara let herself break. She sobbed into him, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the quiet surrender of someone who had fought too long and could no longer bear the weight alone. And Daniel held her, not with promises to fix what was broken, not with empty reassurances, but with the simple truth of his presence. His heartbeat pounded steady against her ear, each thud a reminder that despite everything, despite the storms, the silence, the distance, they were still here, together. The storm raged on around them, water running in rivers at their feet, lightning cracking the sky, thunder rolling through the night, but within the circle of their embrace, there was something unshakable. Not perfection, not resolution, something quieter, something truer. They weren't holding each other to erase the past or to pretend the scars didn't exist. They weren't standing there because everything was suddenly healed. They held each other because, for the first time in a long time, neither of them was alone. In chaos, Daniel and Clara chose love, finding true wealth in a fragile, imperfect moment amidst the storm. In the garden behind the garage, under twinkling lights, Clara and Daniel said, "I do." Sophie and Emily ran down the aisle, scattering petals, shouting, "Now you're our dad!" Daniel unveiled a restored Volkswagen Beetle, engraved, "Every broken thing can be whole again, including us." And in that moment, Clara knew, family isn't blood, it's love, patience, and the courage to begin again.